Dr. Waynetv in California that says that power is the ability to define someone's reality and have that person accept that definition.
Power is the ability to define reality and to have other people respond to your definition as if it were their own. And the most important reality to define is the meaning of your own human beingness.
So we in what they call Black History Month, repping for the black space history. Pure blackness is powerful. There's a lot that can be said about pure absolute blackness. However, I want to make it clear that in this video, I'll be using the term African American and ADOS. When I say African American, I'm talking about those of us who our ancestors go back to the 13 colonies of this nation. Many of our ancestors was in the southern states of this nation. Many of our families started off in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia. They started off in the 13 colonies in the southern states, and then they migrated to places like Detroit. Our families migrated to places like Chicago, New York. Our families migrated to places like California. When I say African American, and I realize that the term is not perfect.
Fundamentally, the term African American is summarily flawed in the sense that it is a continent and a country. African American.
The term is not perfect, it's flawed, because people like Barack Obama, African immigrants who come here from Kenya, African immigrants from Zimbabwe, Botswana, can technically be an African American. But when I say African American, I'm not referring to the Barack Obamas. I mean, God bless them. The Africans that come here and whatever, God bless them. I'm not against them. I wish to unify with them after my people become unified.
Our people, and let me just, and when I say our people, I don't even know really how to label our people.
Our people.
My definition of our people is those of us that have Southern heritage and those of us that, our bloodlines go back to the 13 colonies of this nation. So like I said, we in what they call Black History Month. Pure blackness is powerful. There's a lot that can be said about pure absolute blackness. However, to my understanding, before slavery, we wasn't calling ourselves black people. To my understanding, it was the outsiders, the invaders, the foreigners. They're the ones that called us black people and burnt faces.
The name Ethiopia, however, is of Greek origin, coming from the Greek Ethiopia. Ethiopia is thought to come from the Greek ethor, meaning I burn, and the Greek ops, meaning face. This etymology references a burnt face.
The word for Ethiopians, which is Ethiops, Greek also, burnt skin.
To my understanding, before slavery, we was calling ourselves by a tribal name. We was calling ourselves Igbo, we was calling ourselves Mandi, Fulani, Zulu, Ashanti. To my understanding, there was brown-skinned, woolly-haired people already in America, and even them, they was going by their tribal names. They was known by their tribal names. They was calling themselves Lakota, Cheyenne, Navajo, Oneida, Taino, Arawak. However they pronounce it, those are the English translations of their indigenous names. From my understanding, these brown-skinned, straight-haired people and these brown-skinned, woolly-haired people was never calling themselves black people. I'm aware that, it may have been certain individuals in history that called themselves black or referred to themselves as black.
Krishna means the black one, and Buddha means the black face.
And also, Kemet means the black land, because of the Nile River. The flow of the Nile River enabled them to have a lot of fertile land. So they referred to the land as black, the black land, and that meant Kemet. But other than that, from my understanding, we as a collective people, we never called ourselves black people. To my understanding, the whole term of black people came from racist bigots. From my understanding, it was the Arabs who called it the land of the blacks.
Documents about the history of this region show Arab historians knew it as the Balad al-Sudan, the land of the blacks, the land of the blacks.
So a lot of this black people and stuff started with racist, bigot Arabs, and it trickled down to the Caucasian. It was Caucasian speaking Spanish.
The word for black is
Negro.
Negro.
And Caucasian speaking Latin.
Originally, the Latin Niger just meant black. But at the dawn of America, Niger became Negar.
It trickled down to them when they started calling us Negro and they started calling us niggers and blacks. So I reject all of that. All of them terms is baggage from psychological slavery. There is definitely psychological baggage coming from the physical slavery. It's psychological mental slavery.
They said it, and because they said it, and because they have control over people's minds, it be so. But it don't have to be so. And once you say it's not so, it is not so. And that's power. And that's where we are in need of, is just defining ourselves as a people.
Me personally, I'm personally transforming out of using these type of terms created by racists and bigots for my people. These words are all tied together, and you would have to accept all of them. And I don't want my great-grandchildren being called Negro and niggers. I want to rid myself of these titles. I'm not calling myself the black man anymore, and I'm not referring to my people as black people anymore. And even the Moors, I try not to use the term Moor, because from my understanding, the original North Africans and Arabians who conquered Caucasians and dominated Caucasians, they themselves was not calling themselves Moors.
Basically, you have from 710 to 1086, you have what is known as the Umayyad.
The first one is called the Umayyad dynasty.
They was calling themselves Umayyads, they was calling themselves Almoravids.
The Almoravids were a tribe of nomads from the Sahara. They had black skin and wore veils that covered everything apart from their eyes.
Or, Abbasids, or however they pronounce their names, their indigenous names.
You have the Abbasids, Abba, Abu.
Their dynastic names. They wasn't calling themselves the Moors. From my understanding, the Moors, that title came from Caucasians.
The word is first used by the Greeks. Moros means dark or black. And when the Romans invade West Africa in 46 BC, they speak of the West Africans as Mores, black people from the Greek Moros, dark black.
And from my understanding, that's even the name of Ethiopia. Ethiopia, from my understanding, means land of the burnt faces.
It's like the word Ethiopia. Ethiopia means the land of burnt face, or people of burnt face. Well, Moor means people of burnt face. It meant black. In the language that came out of the Latin languages. Latin is no more, no less than the people that congregated around a place in Europe known as Latium. And out of Latium comes Latin.
These are names and titles that was given by racist bigots. Racist bigots called us black people, burnt-faced people. So all of these little terms came from enslavement.
To these Europeans, one of the most striking features of this land would have been the darker skin tone of the people who lived there. A lot of Europeans may have never seen people with darker skin, leading to them referring to these darker skinned people as having burnt faces, in turn naming the country after this.
Latin-speaking Caucasians who called the North African region Mauritania, or whatever they called it, and it trickled down and it became known as the Moors when referring to North Africans and Arabians. But the actual North Africans and Arabians, from my understanding, was never calling themselves the Moors. We allowed these racist bigots to define us, and we accepted their definition. And now, actually, we're trying to have pride in a definition that they gave to us. They called us black.
The slaves lived outside of the wall in the land of the blacks.
Let the black go free.
They called us black, and we accepted that, and they called us Negro, black, and nigger.
It was Dr. Waynetv in California that says that power is the ability to define someone's reality and have that person accept that definition.
Power is the ability to define reality and to have other people respond to your definition as if it were their own.
We're grown, you know what I'm saying? We grown men, and we don't need other people to name us. You name children and pets. That's who you name. You give names to children and pets, so we're a nation of people. We don't need to be named. We don't have to be named by racist bigots going by these titles of black and everything like that. So, and I realize all of these names are basically tied together. So if you're calling yourself the black man and you're talking about black power, then your great-grandchildren will be known as Negroes. And I reject that. I don't want my great-grandchildren known as Negroes. So you can't call yourself black without being also called the Negro. Black means Negro in Spanish.
Negro.
Because a lot of us, we don't like the term Negro, but we try to have pride in being black.
It's an oxymoron.
The black man.
Negro.
If you call yourself black man, there'd be millions and millions and millions of people calling your children Negroes.
Negro.
Out of all languages in the world, Spanish has the second largest number of native speakers, with 470 million native speakers, as well as another 90 million who speak it as a second language.
Negro.
Spanish is also the third most widely used language on the internet. According to one source that I consulted, the use of Spanish online has grown by 800% in the past few years.
Black is Negro, black is Negro. Negro.
the black man means Negro in Spanish. Negro means the black man, black people. It means the same thing. And the same thing with nigger. From my understanding, nigger started off as a Latin term.
Originally, the Latin niger just meant black.
As a brown-skinned, woolly-haired person, I don't want my great-grandchildren to be called Negroes. Most of the time, we can't control what comes out of other people's mouth. What we can control is whether or not we respond to it. I don't have to respond to someone calling me a black or a Negro. I don't have to check their boxes, whether you black or Negro. Spanish is one of the biggest languages on the earth, and it's, from what I understand, it's just getting bigger.
Did you know by 2050, 10% of the world's population will speak Spanish, and the United States will be the biggest Spanish-speaking country?
Black is Negro, black is Negro.
You know, from what I understand, Spanish is becoming bigger and larger as a spoken language. And if we calling ourselves the black man today, our great-grandchildren will be called Negroes tomorrow by millions and millions of people. So to me, I'm rejecting these things. I'm getting out of the whole black, Negro, nigger matrix.
Once you tell somebody, no, I don't think that's who I am, they've lost all power over you. Once you say that you don't have the power to define who I am, you've taken all power.
¿Soy acaso negra, me dije? Sí. ¿Qué cosa es ser negra? ¡Negra!
I'm aware that some brown-skinned, woolly-haired people, the phrase black and Negro may be cool for them. You know, the term Negro may be cool for them because of their culture. Maybe, you know, they speak Spanish. You know, there's a lot of brown-skinned, woolly-haired people that their first language is Spanish, and they may be cool with the term Negro, and that's cool for them.
De pronto unas voces en la calle me gritaron negra. Negra, 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 negra. Estaba y retrocedí. Negra, y retrocedí. Negra, 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 negra. Negra, 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 negra.
What works for some brown-skinned people may not work for us African Americans. Different nationalities, they come to America for different reasons. You know, they might not be here for our reason. Like, you know, so their experience with America is different. Their relationship with America is different. So again, I say, what works for some brown-skinned people may not work for us.
¿Y qué ritmo tiene? Negro, 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 negro. Fin.
So, you know, I realize all of these names and titles are tied together. So me, I reject these titles. I'm taking myself out the black, Negro, nigger matrix because it's all tied together.
And we are a people who for years people have been defining who we are, and we've been accepting it. Once you tell somebody, no, I don't think that's who I am, they've lost all power over you. Whether you realize or not, and it doesn't make a difference if you're a homeless person in Newark or if you're an IBM executive. Once you say that you don't have the power to define who I am, you've taken all power.
I reject these titles. I'm taking myself out the black, Negro, nigger matrix because it's all tied together. So from now on, basically, I accept names that our people created, names for us, by us. You know, so I accept Asiatic, I accept African American, I can accept ADOS, I accept the name Gullah for our people.
Now is the time for us to disidentify as African Americans, which doesn't even exist. It's not a legal word. It was invented by Jesse Jackson in 1988 to make us feel that we were equal. So now you got Chinese Americans, Arab Americans, Asian Americans, African Americans.
I don't know of any criminal activity done by Jesse Jackson or any foul kind of scandal about Jesse Jackson, so I can accept the name given by our former leader, Jesse Jackson. Even though I may not agree with Jesse Jackson's overall thing, but still, I accept the name African American from our former leader, Jesse Jackson. At one time, Jesse Jackson was our leader, so I can accept African American from Jesse Jackson. I would rather call myself African American, made up by Jesse Jackson, rather than be called a black man that was made by a racist bigot. You know, I trust that Jesse Jackson had good intentions when he created the term African American or came up with the term African American. I can accept that. It's not a perfect name. Of course, it needs to be improved, and I'm all for us coming into a vote on our name, or I'm all for that. You know, us coming with a better term. I like the name ADOS. To me is legally and factually correct. You know, if you're dealing with facts, you're dealing with legal terminology. ADOS, American Descendants of Slavery, is a very factual terminology when describing our people. You know what I'm saying? And it was created, as far as I understand, African American, and ADOS was created by brown-skinned, woolly-haired people. My people with Southern heritage. I can accept that. You know what I'm saying? So that's where I'm at with the video. So that's just an introduction to the video going forward, just to let you know that I will be using the terms African American and ADOS when referring to my people. Also, I am aware that some people say that Africa, the continent Africa, was named after a Caucasian guy. I'm not 100% certain on this. I'm still studying. I hear different things. I hear that Africa actually came from an indigenous name. I hear different things. I'm not 100% certain yet. I'm still studying. But like I say, in any event, it really doesn't matter, because as far as I'm concerned, it was one of our leaders that gave us that name, and I can accept a name from our leader. But like I say, the name Africa itself may have came from a Caucasian. You know, I'm still studying that.
Everything that is out here is still the same thing. It's your depth of perception of what you're looking at. We are looking at a perceptual world of what Europeans have superimposed over us. What we have to do as a people is to go back to our rich tradition and begin to look at the world through our eyes. Look at the world through our eyes.
As far as Caucasian people, I've many years ago been stopped referring to Europeans and Caucasians as white. European, Americans, and Caucasians are flesh color. They're flesh tone color, and that's just what it is. They're flesh color, flesh tone color. I've been stopped referring to those people as white. To me, all of that white, black, nigger, Negro matrix is all psychological slavery, baggage from psychological slavery, as seeing them as white. And now I'm at the point where I'm rejecting the term called black people. I'm rejecting the whole black people thing, because from my understanding, we wasn't calling ourselves black people before the transatlantic enslavement. And another reason is because as long as I call myself the black man, it'd be millions and millions of other people who has every right to call me Negro. As far as Caucasian or European Americans, and that's what it is. You know, I'll call them Italian, I'll call them Russian, I'll call them Englishmen, I'll call them, you know, Irish. But to me, there's no such thing as, I've never saw a white person ever in my life. So to me, I've seen flesh tone color people. You know, their skin is flesh tone or flesh color.
The flesh tone color wheel allows you to see color theory in skin tone. I like to think of the flesh tone color wheel as a game board, and there are two ways to start playing. First one is to find your skin on the wheel. How do you do that? Well, you can kind of hold it up and spin it around until you find the color closest to you.
So those are the names that I'll use. They're flesh color Europeans, there's flesh tone color Europeans. And that's just what it is.
I said a couple weeks ago on Twitter that I didn't want to see any more slave movies. It's not just the fact that because of out of the extensive history that the original people have, slavery always seems to be the focus. It seems like there's such a blatant monetization of black suffering. Apparently killing and brutalizing black people is a very lucrative industry. That's not even the most bothersome thing to me. What bothers me the most is the consistent rewriting of our historical narratives. In this new Harriet movie, the majority of the main characters didn't even exist. Marie, Harriet's friend, made up. Get this, the main villain in this story, the black male bounty hunter that makes it his life's mission to capture Harriet, is made up. I'm sorry, but this blatant agenda to vilify black men, to make out black men to be these violent thugs or these sexual deviants, has to be called out. How you gonna make up a villain and make him be a black bounty hunter at that, which was incredibly rare? This is the reason why it's imperative that we learn our own history, that we don't get our history from the media, from movies, or from what people are telling us. We have to research and know for ourselves.
I agree with what the lady said. You know, every couple of years, it seems like they just keep dropping another big slave movie, another big movie about segregation and slavery, African-American slavery, about African-American weak points in history. And you know what? I don't even disagree with it, but I'm just getting to the point where it's starting to become like redundant. It becomes like over and over and over, just showing our slavery, never showing no one else's slavery. Every couple of years, they just keep dropping these slave movies or segregation movies or some kind of servitude movie. They're making a lot of money off of it. And my thing is this, I'm not even disagreeing with it. Okay, that's cool. You know, you want to show our slavery and everything, our weak point in history. Okay, but what about showing other people's slavery? When you keep seeing slave movies over and over, it makes it seem like African Americans were the only slaves in history.
In the way that the history of slavery is written, is that the vast majority of it has been written by Europeans and Americans. So it's extremely biased.
Don't just focus on African American, because see, my concern is that it's building a low self-esteem and low confidence.
Modern day slavery is a bitch, boss. We sick.
You know, our people, our children will start just having low self-esteem and low confidence, thinking that we are here to be slaves or you know what I'm saying, or whatever.
See, our problem is totally mental.
But show everybody servitude. Show the original slaves. Because in order to really tell a whole slavery story, really you should start from the beginning.
Backtracking it, to understand who we are, where we are, and how did we get here, you have to understand the Moors.
And so show everything. Show all slavery. Show Jamaicans as slaves. Show Antiguans as slaves. Show Trinidad as slaves. Puerto Ricans were slaves. Dominicans were slaves. Show everybody slavery in Hollywood. You know, like there's never no movies about no one else's enslavement. You know, so my thing is, when is Hollywood gonna start making big blockbuster movies about the original slaves? You know, I would love to see movies about the original slaves. European servitude, about when Europeans were servants. Europeans were slaves. Europeans were the original slaves.
The first slavery was white slavery. Talk about that. White folks sold their people to the Moors the moment they saw Moors coming.
And that is the white slave trade. Slave comes from Slav. And the reason why the word slave comes from Slav is that the first slaves are white.
The original slaves were European. The word slave comes from the word Slav, which you guys think of Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, right? Because of the amount of slaves that came from that region, that came from the region of the Europeans.
When is Hollywood gonna start making big blockbuster movie? I mean, like ever since what, Roots? Ever since Roots in 1977, in the late 70s, they've been dropping slave movie after you know, segregation movie. So my thing is, okay, but let's spend the next 40 years dropping big blockbuster movies about European servitude, European slavery. The Caucasians was in slavery, in bondage. Now, of course, their enslavement or their servitude was nowhere near as brutal as ours.
Moors have organized servitude. In other words, when you were in working force of someone that was above you, you were not a slave, you were a servant. It was not a legal system, it was a social status. You were a human being. You were allowed the right to a hearing if you had been transgressed against, even if it was by the so-called person that was over you.
From my understanding, their servitude and enslavement was nowhere near as unjust as ours. You know, chattel slavery. But still, they were servants. They were servants and they were slaves, and not only that, they're the original servants, they're original slaves. So my thing is, let's make some big blockbuster movies about their low points in history, their weak points in history.
The original slaves were European.
So Europeans got a thing that they do very well. They hide their ancestors' weak points in history, or they're, you know, surrounded with half-truths in history.
And the Dark Ages is the ages that Europeans don't like to look at. They don't like to remember.
It seems like they'd rather focus on our weak points in history, capitalize on our weak points in history. But what about your weak points in history? When is Hollywood gonna start doing blockbuster movies about the Europeans in slavery? Europeans were slaves to the North Africans and Arabians. Matter of fact, there was a couple of times, to my understanding, Europeans was enslaved to the North Africans and Arabians. But when are we gonna start doing big blockbuster movies about that? I'm not exactly certain on why Europeans was put into slavery. And that's something that Hollywood could highlight. Hollywood could highlight exactly why Europeans was put into servitude, why they was put into slavery. You know, I've come across different information. Some of the information that I've come across over the years is that, from my understanding, Europeans tried to create a way of life where having sexual intimacy with animals was normal. So most of the civilized world knew that that was foul. That was an abomination. From my understanding, Europeans created a society where sex with animals was normal.
Now, she-wolf to me is a female dog. And you know what they call a female dog. And this is in their story. That their mother, Romulus and Remus, came from a she-wolf. And that Romulus and Remus fought each other. And Remus lost. Romulus won. And so the capital of this central Italian area became Rome.
And also, from my understanding, Europeans also, they tried to create a society where grown men having sex with young boys was normal, you know, but for the North Africans and the Arabians, that was foul. That was an abomination. Most of the civilized world knew that was foul. That was an abomination. These are the things that Caucasians or Europeans was involved in. They was involved in this way of life. So that's the information I come across, but I say let Hollywood straighten it out. Let Hollywood tell the story of why Caucasians was the first slaves. What did they do that made them the first slaves? I would love to see that. That'd be a great movie storyline. You could do at least 40, 50 movies out of that.
And the Dark Ages is the ages that Europeans don't like to look at. They don't like to remember.
It was the golden age of the Moors, they call it, when the North Africans and Arabians dominated Europeans. It's refreshing. Every now and then you see a very small documentary where Caucasians admit the truth about the North Africans dominating them.
The Almoravids were a tribe of nomads from the Sahara. They had black skin and wore veils that covered everything apart from their eyes.
I know that there's a couple of books out about the North Africans and Arabians when they dominated Europeans for hundreds of years. You know, there was a couple of servitude periods that Europeans was under. So there's a couple of good books about it, and there's been a lot of books turned into movies. You know, a lot of movies came from books. And so there's no reason why they can't take these books about the Moors and turn them into big blockbuster movies. The same way they do big blockbuster movies about African American slavery and servitude and African American issues. So they could do the same thing with the Europeans. Turn these books into big blockbuster movies.
Barbary Coast starts on the sort of top left of Africa, so the Atlantic coast of Morocco. It stretches through into the Straits of Gibraltar and then along that North African coast through all the kind of places which are in the news at the moment, Algiers, Tunis, and the city kingdom of Tripoli, which is modern-day Libya. That 2,000-mile stretch of North African coastline, that's the Barbary Coast. Something like 1 million Europeans were sold into slavery on the Barbary Coast in the 17th century. Something like 1 million Europeans were sold into slavery on the Barbary Coast in the 17th century.
Men, women, children, and sold as what? As domestic servants, as galley slaves? And
all of those things, Lewis. And also, importantly, if they were well connected, they're held for ransom. So they can be sort of taken on as cheap labour, but also they're encouraged to write home to London or Bristol in England and to say, look, help, mum and dad, brothers, sisters, send money. I'm trapped here and my owner has set a price on my head, and the only way I'm going to get free is if you send money.
You know, pirate movies? We would love to see some great pirate movies. Let's see some pirate movies where Caucasians are the ones in servitude. I think that'd be a big blockbuster hit. A great pirate movies with the effects and with the, cinematography and all this stuff about the Caucasians in servitude. I think that'd be a great movie. I would love to see that type of thing. I would take my whole family to see that type of movie highlighting Caucasians in servitude.
They traded in their own people for hundreds of years before Europeans. Yes, white slavery was it. Selling particularly their daughters. They would sell them all over the world.
The original slaves were European.
Why was Caucasians selling their own women? I would love to see a Hollywood movie about that. Let's make 40 different movies about that. The same way they keep talking about our weak point in history, but talk about your weak point in history also. The original slaves.
The original slaves were European.
At one point, it seemed like North Africans and Arabians was like saviors to them, like came to save them.
You have to remember that it's in this context that the Arabs arrive. not as marauding destroyers, but sometimes as saviors.
It was a great pride to be able to have a black face on your family shield.
You have white women finding themselves into the concubinages or harems of Arabs and Africans.
But when you say soul slave, how you mean literally? Kind of explain how, and where they sold them to, and what did they
sold to Moorish princes, and you know, in many families, the wives and the children reportedly were so relieved when they were sold. They were better treated by Moors as servants than they were as wives to their European husbands.
Now, there's a bunch of pictures all over the internet about these time periods, but I'm a little unclear about which was which. I'm not sure which pictures are from the 700s, paintings or drawings or whatever, and then some of the paintings or drawings is about the 1800s. But there's an actual photo that I know for sure they dated at the 1800s. There's an actual photo of European servants, servitude, that they date at the 1800s. From my understanding, it was Americans getting abducted and held for ransom, and you know, different Europeans. I don't know, but you know, I'm a little unclear. That's what I'm saying. Hollywood could do a big blockbuster movie to set it all straight. Teach the masses of people about your servitude. Teach the masses of people about your enslavement to the North Africans and Arabians. I think it'd be a big hit, a blockbuster hit, to see Europeans in servitude. This should be common knowledge when Europeans was getting kidnapped and held for ransom. Kidnapped by North Africans and Arabians and held for ransom.
From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli.
See, we don't know this because they are so focused on us in the newspaper nowadays. It seems like we are the ones that are so perverse and depraved.
Right, so European Americans seem to want to keep their slavery and their servitude hidden while they gladly expose our servitude and our weak points in history. It's causing low self-esteem in our people, and you can see it all over the internet, all over social media. A lot of our people are just talking with such a low self-esteem and low confidence in each other.
Modern day slavery is a bitch, boss. We sick.
And, you know, like I say, the fact of the matter is almost all nationalities had their time as servants in slavery. So instead of just making Hollywood movies about African-American slavery and African-American servitude and African-American weak points, make big blockbuster movies about other people's slavery also.
Backtracking it, to understand who we are, where we are, and how did we get here, you have to understand the Moors. Because the reason why we even have a Western civilization today is because of the Moor.
If you do not understand the Moors, it's very difficult for us as a people to understand why we're in the position that we're in today.
So from my understanding, our situation in America, African American, ADOS, basically stems from the North Africans and Arabians, what the North Africans and Arabians did about 1,300 years ago. Basically, from my understanding, in today's terms, how we would describe it, we describe it as a bum rush. You know, in hip-hop, in the golden era of hip-hop, we called it a bum rush. We called it getting your posseing up and bum rush things. So from my understanding, that's basically what happened. The North Africans and Arabians was like master ship builders. Like they had real fast ships, sturdy, fast, strong ships. And they was real good on the water. So what happened was, from my understanding, because it's just a small piece of water that separates Europe from Africa. The tip of Africa, the tip of Europe is just a small stretch of water. So from my understanding, the North Africans and Arabians is basically posseed up and bum rushed Europe over that small strip of water, 7,000 deep. And that must have been a sight to see. In the middle of the night, 7,000 North Africans and Arabians bum rushing you in the middle of the night.
This little stretch of water between Spain and Morocco is only 9 miles wide. But it's come to represent some kind of cultural chasm between Europe and Africa. But in the 8th century, when sea travel was the way to get around, that wasn't a barrier, it was a highway.
I've seen things in my life, you know, as far as a teenager, seeing dudes posse up and bum rush things. And, you know, I hear tales of the Black Spades, how they used to get together, how many, it was so many of them. In the Zulu Nation days, it was a lot of them.
We came rolling up here, we walked down Sandview Avenue, walked in the Monroe Projects, we marching. There's about 100 of us. We marching like Z-U-L-U. That's the way you say Zulu. And we're marching down the block like that.
That might have been a couple of hundred maximum. You know, in the gang days in the 70s in the Bronx, of course, New York, you know, you might have seen a couple of hundred maximum. But imagine 6,000, 7,000 North Africans and Arabians bum rushing you in the middle of the night. There is no police, there is no federal agents, there is nothing to stop them. And back then, from my understanding, there was no street lights in Europe at that time. So when it got dark, it got real dark. But they're not just coming with violence, they're coming with violence and education.
In July 7/11, 7,000 Berber tribesmen stormed across the Straits of Gibraltar and invaded Europe. The Muslims then began an incredible process of expansion. In just 4 years, they'd colonised almost the whole of Spain, had crossed the Pyrenees, and were only halted at Poitiers in France.
From 710 until 1492, Africans ruled this part of the world and bring civilization to this part of the world.
In the year 711 AD, Muslim forces invaded Spain and created a society so rich and so powerful it was the envy of the known world. This wasn't the rigid, ferocious Islam of our imaginations, but a progressive, sensuous, intellectually curious culture that for a number of spine-tingling years looked set to sweep through the whole of Europe. It is an incredible story, but one that has been systematically written out of history. So from
my understanding, the North Africans and Arabians was bringing violence and education. From my understanding, they was bringing education in the form of basic hygiene. From my understanding, this is where the European learned how to wash his hands after he uses the bathroom, things like that, because from my understanding at this time in European history, they was going like backwards. They had a backwards lifestyle. Like I said, they was intermingling with animals and sexual intimacy with animals. So they was, you know, a lot of germs and a lot of just filth.
Moors went in there and said, no. The first thing the Africans brought in was soap. Right. They said, before I even touch the land, we got to clean y'all up because y'all a little funky up in here. And then the Moors brought in something that they call alcohol, A-L-K-U-H-L, which today we call alcohol.
There are also a lot of words in Spanish that begin with al, which is the Arabic definite article. For example, alcohol, from the Arabic word alcohol, which of course means alcohol.
Because they said after we clean you up, we got to disinfect you because you're sick. Remember, this was the bubonic plague they had. They call it the Black Plague.
They wasn't keeping their basic hygiene up. So from my understanding, the Moors basically came with the education and educated the Europeans on basic hygiene. How to wash your hands thoroughly after you urinate. Wash your hands after you defecate. How to, you know, they built all kinds of public baths where, you know, you could bathe yourself. However that worked with the public bath, They built libraries, 70, 80 libraries in certain cities.
There were in Spain at that same time, under the Moors, more than 70 public libraries.
Reports from European visitors to Cordoba describe a city with 70 libraries and over 300 public baths.
From my understanding, the North Africans and Arabians showed them how to build street lights, you know, down your block or down your avenue. The North Africans and Arabians are the ones that showed them, educated them on how to build hot and cold running water.
Well, for one thing, in some of the areas that they bring hot and cold running water. There was actually a city in Cordova that ran for miles, lit by lights, lamps.
The accounts tell of houses with running water and roads illuminated by streetlights. Abderrahman brought cutting-edge technology for irrigation to Spain. Almost immediately, the landscape was transformed.
The Spanish city of Cordova in the 10th century was very much like a modern city. Its streets were well paved. The sidewalks were raised for the pedestrians, and at night you could walk for 10 miles by the light of lamps, flanked by uninterrupted extents of buildings. This is Cordova in the 900s. Europe would not see this for another 400 years.
They showed them alcohol and soap. They showed them, you know, how to sanitize, wash your hands after you urinate. And also, like, the North Africans and Arabians showed them how to build a sewer system. Like the Europeans, they didn't know these things. They didn't have education on how to build a sewer system, you know, for your waste and be drained away. And they didn't know how to do these type of things.
Another thing that the Moors brought was a sewer system. When Europeans went to the bathroom, they went right there. They might have segregated themselves into a corner of the room, but they dug a little hole and they went to the bathroom there. When the Moors got there, they said, no man, you got to run that stuff out of your house. So what they did is they started the sewer system that would run drainage through the house down into a segregated area of the community.
And this channel over here is part of the water system that brought Cordoba its famously effective sewage works, as well as the fountains and the baths that so impressed all those European visitors.
That all of the waste, all of the garbage, everything was channeled down in that area so that it was not within the compound. So think of the structure of the mind of the African, understanding, okay, you put animals in corrals and coops, you put your waste in a sewer system, you have hot and cold running water, they had air conditioning.
Another most amazing thing was that the Moors were the first to introduce air conditioning.
By the way in which they built their house, they understood waves and the way in which the earth was structured, so that, you know, there are some places in a house that you go that you might say, I always go in there because a cool breeze runs through there.
Inside the palace walls, the architecture is breathtaking. Although the aesthetic of this courtyard is quite cool and minimal now, in its heyday it would have been a riot of colour. Granada was very famous for producing silks, and you'd have had silk hangings billowing in the breeze, and silk cushions and silk rugs where people laid out to eat their dinner and to listen to music.
Is that if you had studied the way in which your house, where your house was built, you would know that by the nature of your surrounding environment, a cool wind passes through a certain way. If you open up one window and a door, the wind will go at a particular time. The Moors understood this direction, and that's what air conditioning was.
When they brought cool air into the house, it wasn't just cool, it was perfume. They ran it over banks of flowers, noted for their perfume.
And in fact, it's only when you get down to rug level that you appreciate one of the bits of magic of the place, because from down here, this pool acts like a kind of infinity mirror, and the whole of the palace just looks as if it's suspended in water.
From my understanding, at this time, the Europeans was building, they lived in barns. The North African Arabians showed them how to build, like, in those days it was like castles, but I guess it was like a mansion. And, you know, they showed them castles and extravagant living.
At the time I'm talking about here, the kings and queens of Europe lived in barns.
While the inhabitants of London were still living in wooden houses, the people of Cordoba had built a cosmopolitan city with a population of over 100,000.
The castles that you see are not their castles. They did not build those castles.
While the English kings of the same period were living in modest wooden halls, Abderrahman III needed 10,000 workmen to construct this enormous palace complex, which was decorated with African white marble. The hospitals of Cordoba were performing operations which wouldn't be seen in the rest of Europe for hundreds of years. Europe underwent a massive intellectual and cultural revolution. This shift, known as the Renaissance, transformed the human experience.
They did addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, fractions, plane geometry, in that order.
The key to the Alhambra's design is the simple relationship between the side of a square and its diagonal. If we use the diagonal to make a rectangle, and then the diagonal from that rectangle to make another, we get a progression of rectangles. The fourth rectangle is double the size of the first. And the diagonals in this sequence are in fact the square roots of 2, 3, 4 and 5. A magical sequence.
They did addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, fractions, plane geometry, in that order.
Every detail of the palace decoration seems to be part of a scheme. Row upon row of intricate geometric patterns are carved into the woodwork of the walls and windows.
The one thing they brought was corral, where they taught Europeans how to put animals in corrals instead of having them run through their homes. That's why we have chicken pox today. Because Europeans used to have chickens running in and out of their homes. The Africans say, you don't have animals in your home. Animals stay outside. They're in a corral or they're in a chicken coop. But that's where animals belong. And so the Moors brought the concept of separating humans from animals.
The windmill was introduced into Europe by the Moors. Gunpowder was introduced into Europe by the Moors. Artillery was introduced into Europe by the Moors. The nautical instruments like the astrolabe and the compass, the three-cornered or four-cornered axle rudder, the three-masted ships, all these were introduced by the Moors.
Also, the North Africans, from my understanding, they brought them paper. You know, the Europeans, the Caucasians, they didn't know about paper. You know, so North Africans and Arabians introduced paper to the Europeans for the first time.
The Arabs brought in one innovation that did more than any other to change the cultural makeup of Europe. And it's this, paper.
Paper was introduced by the Moors into Spain.
See, the Europeans at this time were an extremely ignorant people. Kings and queens were illiterate.
And when the Arabs come to Spain, they start to open paper-making factories.
Every university, whether it be Salamanca, whether it be the University of Coimbra, whether it be a university in France, anywhere in the world, it would have been scholars that sat at the feet of Moors that then went to that part of the world because Europe had no schools.
The universities that were founded in Paris, Bologna and Oxford at this time based their new curriculum on the radical ideas which were pouring out of Toledo.
It would have been scholars that sat at the feet of Moors that then went to that part of the world because Europe had no schools.
Oh, Europe had no schools?
No, it had no school. Not only did that, but they were not literate. They could not read. There were no books.
Art, literature and science prospered as they then prospered nowhere else in Europe. Students flocked from France and Germany and England to drink from the fountain of learning which flowed only in the cities of the Moors.
Oxford University was founded by Jews who sat at the feet of Moors and went to England and formed Oxford University.
And the travellers from Toledo brought more than just practical knowledge back to England.
They taught botany, zoology, geology, medicine, in that order.
Also, the North African Arabians brought them the 0 through 9 number system. They got the number system and they brought it to the Caucasians and Europeans.
That the Europeans only counted with letters. The Europeans did not have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. If you talk about Roman numerals, it's IX and X, and those are letters. The Greeks used letters to count with. The Romans used letters. It is the Indian, the Hindu who had those numerals, and Arabs brought it out of India.
But of course, the most obvious and lasting impact is the use of Arabic numerals. And in this Spanish Latin text, which dates from around about 986 AD, we have the first example of Arabic numerals written in Europe. Here they are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Imagine trying to do something like multiplication with Roman numerals. Once the numbers get above a certain amount, they are ridiculously unwieldy. This new, agile numerical system made everyday things like bookkeeping and accounting more accessible. Mathematics developed.
They did addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, fractions, plane geometry, in that order.
Every piece of evidence from Cordoba adds to the picture of a civilized and highly sophisticated city.
And we notice that the Moorish city of Cordoba, which is often regarded as the medieval world's most cosmopolitan and sophisticated city, it has 1,600 mosques, 900 public baths,
It had medical centres, an organised legal system, and libraries full of academics and scientists working on ideas which were light years ahead of anything else in Europe.
So from my understanding, the Moors dominated, even, like I said, it was refreshing to see Caucasians admit the truth. They do their little documentaries, but like I said, I'm waiting for a big motion picture. I think it'd be great to see a great big motion picture about how the North Africans and Arabians dominated and taught Caucasians for hundreds of years. As just a side note, what happened with the Moors, from my understanding, is that some of them strayed off. It happens all the time in everyday life. People build a connection with the Supreme Being, and sometimes that connection is a very good connection. And when you develop a good connection with the Supreme Being, a lot of times you become a major force on earth. You become a dominant force in whatever you're doing. You become successful in whatever you're doing on earth. And sometimes that becomes a head trip. Success sometimes becomes a head trip, and then people start forgetting and they go astray. So from my understanding, what happened with the Moors is they started to stray off into their astrology, their astronomy, more into their mathematics. They got too much wrapped up into that, and they forgot the source of their power, which is Allah. This is from my understanding what happened to the Moors. And what happened is they had infighting amongst themselves, because some Moors wanted to have that, that fundamental worship of Allah as the foundation. And I think a lot of them started to go astray into the extravagant life.
The Almoravids were a tribe of nomads from the Sahara. They had black skin and wore veils that covered everything apart from their eyes. But they were fiercest of all when it came to religion. They preached a return to basic Muslim values, and when they came to Al-Andalus, they were shocked by what they found. What did they think had gone wrong with Islam here?
They felt they had to purify things. They said, this is people very accustomed to civilization, to science. They're talking with Christians, with Jews. This is a mix that we don't like it. We want purified people.
And there was infighting. And the infighting led to the destruction of the Moorish Empire. And that happens everywhere. Egypt, wherever we go in the world, they do not have the powers or the number to overtake us. They exploit us fighting each other. And that's been their history. They don't have the power. We give them the power. In fact, the more powerful they become is the more power that we give them. Because if we really analyze them for what they really were, we would know they are not what they pretend to be.
With the barbaric Christian raiders on one side and these new fundamentalist Muslims on the other, Al-Andalus was crushed. It descended into corruption.
There was a day that in Granada they took over 300,000, and again I'm afraid of numbers because it could be much more than this. Be less, but it could be more, texts, and they put it in the middle of the court, and they put all of the texts on fire because they said they were books of the devil, because they were written in Arabic and they were probably Qurans.
Not a single account of life here survives. All its archives were incinerated in the fires of the Inquisition.
And a massive destruction of Moorish documents occurred.
From now on, Spain would concentrate on cleaning the Muslim presence from its country.
Burn them. And today they celebrate the day of the bonfire. And that's what they're celebrating when they celebrate the day of the bonfire. This is celebrated in many Spanish-speaking countries today.
And this is a very important part of history. To my understanding, when the North Africans and Arabians dominated Caucasians, they brought them education. So when they brought them to education, basically the Caucasian Europeans, they basically just soaked it all up, absorbed a lot of the information, and spit it out and regurgitated it. But when they spit it out, regurgitated it, they put it basically in their image. Like, this is when a lot of their, they call the Renaissance. They had their Renaissance, and they had the great painters, the Michelangelo. This is when Leonardo da Vinci. This is when even Tupac, he mentioned Machiavelli. This is when all of these people was born, like around this time when they finally got the Moors out. They finally got the Moors out in the 1400s. And this is when they started drawing like the prophets, the Bible prophets in their image. I guess they learned astrology. They put the astrology in their image. They put everything, they flipped all the knowledge around, but they just put everything in their image. And this is how they empowered themselves.
It would take time for these groundbreaking ideas to become assimilated into Christian Europe, but once they were, Western intellect was transformed, and Arabic translations of Greek geometry and those new Arabic numerals were passed on to craftsmen and architects. This was a critical stage in the growth of Western thought. We should no longer see the Renaissance as a rebirth, but the continuation of an intellectual movement which had been nourished centuries earlier by Muslims.
And because of their gunpowder and their germs, basically they took over the world. And, you know, but like I say, this period is very important. They call the Renaissance. Even around this time, Caesar Borgia, the guy that is rumored to have modeled for the Caucasian Jesus, I don't know if it's 100% factual, but this is what they say. They say, you know, Caesar Borgia is the one that they painted, the one that modeled for the picture of the European Caucasian Jesus.
The Europeans had a perfect right to make Christ white, because once they were converted to Christ, fine, but don't go pushing it down other people's throat. That is the point. Don't come telling me about the white Christ, because the first physical representation of Christ is found in a coin of Justinian II, and when you look at him, he has African hair, he has the woolly hair, he has brown skin, he has a Semitic type nose.
So I agree with the teacher on this topic of Jesus. It's understandable for Europeans to make Jesus in their image. We shouldn't have to be forced to teach our children a Caucasian Jesus. You know what I'm saying? So that's where I'm at with it. I agree with the teacher. You know, any children growing up around me is going to automatically see the brown skin, woolly hair prophets. They're automatically going to see that. Me personally, I've seen that whole European thing reversed in one generation. I mean, I've seen children from when they was in Pampers, all they ever saw was a brown skinned Jesus on the wall. Their first impression of Jesus was brown skin, woolly hair. Now that they 20 and 21 in their mid-20s, now that they grown adults, they still got that vision of a brown skinned Jesus in their mind. So even if they don't grow up to be Christians, even if they don't grow up to be religious, at least they won't grow up with that old slave mentality of looking at Europeans as the son of God. And God willing, hopefully they can pass on the same pictures of the prophets and the brown skinned, woolly haired Jesus to their children. And then they just keep going on generational. Their children pass it on, pass it on, pass it on. And it keeps going like that. Hopefully, God willing, that's how it happened, until one day humanity can get to the level where there is no pictures of the prophets and we just go by the teachings of the prophets, just go by the spoken word of the prophets. But until then, with all these pictures around, I feel it necessary that I have to replace all of these pictures that's around us with brown skin, woolly haired vision of the prophets and Jesus. I'm not going to leave the children just bare naked to deal with this world without something reinforcing them. You understand? So I would advise all my brothers, even if you don't believe in Jesus, even if you say Jesus is a fairy tale, as much as, like for instance, much as I don't really deal with Egyptian culture, I still show any children around me my vision of Egypt of brown skinned, woolly haired Egyptians, even though I don't deal with Egypt culture. Because if I make a mistake and don't show children their first impression of brown skinned, woolly haired Egyptians, then their first impression might be the Egyptians they see in the movies. And the Egyptians they're going to see in the movies, the Caucasian Egyptians. So sometimes first impressions last a long time. Sometimes first impressions, they stay with you. They may not never be able to get rid of that first impression. That first impression is important. I also got to say, we're never supposed to make a picture of who we call God. We're never supposed to make an image of the Most High, the most powerful being, the supreme being. We're never supposed to make a picture or image of the supreme being. But back to the original point. The original point is Caesar Borgia. From my understanding, Caesar Borgia and all these people was living around this time of what they call the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is basically an extension of what the North Africans and Arabians taught the Europeans.
We should no longer see the Renaissance as a rebirth, but the continuation of an intellectual movement which had been nourished centuries earlier by Muslims.
If they had not done this, Renaissance and scientific revolution would have been impossible.
During the 1400s and 1500s, Europeans started making these portraits that's still embedded in some of our people's mind.
Do you think that Spanish people today are proud at all of the Arabic episode in their history, or are they ashamed of it?
No, not at all. Strictly speaking, it's not our past. It's the past of other people. As a modern-day Spaniard, I would feel very little connection with the Arab past. Spanish people don't live like them. We don't dress like them. We don't feel like them. I don't know how you can say we are the same, because we are not the same. We have nothing in common. Nothing in common. And if I weren't a professor of Arabic studies, I would have absolutely no feeling for Muslim culture.
In the 18th century, the Moors invaded Spain and introduced Arabic. Around 4,000 words in Spanish dictionaries come from Arabic, particularly in the fields of science, technology, agriculture, and trade, including many place names. Al is the in Arabic, and most Spanish words beginning with al came from Arabic. After 700 years of power struggles, King Alfonso X decreed Castilian, a formal dialect of Spanish, be used for all official documents, and ta-da! Spanish was the official language of Spain.
So from my understanding, this is basically how the whole transatlantic enslavement started, from these Europeans speaking Spanish, these Europeans speaking Portuguese. To my understanding, they're the ones that started the whole transatlantic enslavement. Everything that they've been taught and they've learned from the North Africans and Arabians for 700 years, now they learned it. They learned how to build fast boats.
There's evidence of Africans bringing elephants into China. But if you're bringing elephants into China, what kind of boats must you have? What kind of technology that would allow you to bring elephants? You don't do that on no canoe. So they would have to have had high-powered wisdom. Not only that, but you've got to know that if you have a certain amount of weight, how you're going to travel on the water. So they must have had great navigational skills to know how to bring elephants from Africa to China.
The nautical instruments like the astrolabe and the compass, the three-cornered or four-cornered axle rudder, the three-masted ships, all these were introduced by the Moors.
Where did he learn how to get on the waters? He learned from the Moors. Why is Portugal and Spain the countries of Europe that are moving out of the Dark Ages first? What is it happening here that's not happening every other place? The Moors.
So these Caucasian Europeans from Portugal and Spain, now they learned it. They learned how to build fast boats. These Europeans speaking Spanish and Portuguese, these are the ones that they learned about gunpowder. And they started making cannons, and they started making rifles and cannons with gunpowder.
Cortez brought the most cutting-edge weaponry available, including cannons.
Cannons like these were small but effective. Not only did they tear major holes in native formations, but they scared the hell out of them. They didn't have gunpowder in the New World before Cortez got there. So on the battlefield, a weapon like this was a distinct physical and psychological advantage.
The conquistadors also carried a matchlock musket that shot a solid lead ball. Not very accurate, but deadly at close range.
And that's how everything started to change, because when they got access to gunpowder and cannons, everything started to change around.
And you know, we were the warriors of the world at one time, until the gun came along. You know, the gun is a coward's instrument, by the way, even though we invented that too.
So we taught them how to do that. We taught them the gun. It was we that brought the fire stick into Europe. They didn't know nothing about guns.
Gunpowder was introduced into Europe by the Moors. Artillery was introduced into Europe by the Moors.
From my understanding, they learned the gunpowder, the rifle, all these things from the North Africans and Arabians. This is when they start putting it to use. This is when the transatlantic enslavement started. These Europeans with Spanish names, Garcia, Hernandez, Lopez, Vasquez, Sanchez, Diaz, Guzman. These are the Europeans speaking Spanish. They was Catholic Europeans, Roman Catholic Europeans speaking Spanish. Europeans from Spain and Portugal. And from my understanding, before they even found the Caribbean island, before they found South America, North America, Central America, and before Christopher Columbus, they was making voyages and they found the west coast of Africa. And from my understanding, they was making friendships with the Africans on the west coast of Africa. They was making friendships with the Africans. And when they found the Africans, from my understanding, they found that the African tribes had conflicts with other African tribes. The African tribes was in conflict.
The first Europeans who came to Ghana were the Portuguese, and they arrived in 1471. And when they got here, they found that there was a brisk trade in slaves. between Ghana and its West African neighbors. And when they got here, they found that there was a brisk trade in slaves between Ghana and its West African neighbors. And for 100 years, Portugal remained on the coast of Ghana and took part in this coastal trade, going to Senegal, bringing goods from Senegal, from Nigeria to Ghana, and bringing slaves in exchange for gold. And this was a situation before the transatlantic slave trade was introduced.
So from my understanding, this is what happened. The Europeans from Portugal and Spain, they developed a friendship with the West Africans. They had trade, they had a friendship with the West Africans. They did trade with them for a few years, a few decades. They did trade with them. They saw how the Africans put each other in servitude. From my understanding, that's what they did. They studied, they analyzed, and they watched the Africans' way of life. From my understanding, like an African tribe, when they captured a rival African tribe, they will put him in servitude. Because from my understanding, the Africans didn't have a prison system. So any criminal in Africa, he was made a servant. If you was a criminal, you became a servant.
Those who committed crimes, convicts, could be sold into slavery. If you owed a debt, you could be sold into slavery. Sometimes through deceit, or you could be tricked into slavery.
So that's how my understanding how the Africans dealt with their criminals. They made them servants. They forced them into servitude. So from my understanding, when these Europeans speaking Spanish and Portuguese, when they came and they started making friendships with the Africans, this is what they found. They found that the African tribes didn't get along with each other. So from my understanding, these Europeans from Portugal and Spain, they was doing a lot of trade with the West Africans, and they was looking for sugar. And they was looking for sugar and salt. They was looking for the things that the North Africans and Arabians introduced to them. So from my understanding, this is what was going on right before Christopher Columbus started sailing. From my understanding, Christopher Columbus had to get permission from the Spanish Empire. At this time in history, from my understanding, the Spanish was dominant. Spanish and Portugal, they was dominant because of everything they learned from the North Africans and Arabians. So Christopher Columbus got permission from the Spanish to go sailing on voyages. And from my understanding, he even had brown-skinned, woolly-haired men with him. It was brown-skinned, woolly-haired men with him. It was North Africans and Arabians with him, but the thing is, the Spanish was in control. So any brown-skinned, woolly-haired men with Columbus was under Spanish rule, from my understanding.
The year was 1492. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabel had decided to support a voyage overseas for a new route to India in search of spices.
They're looking for sugar. Europeans got hooked on sugar. Moors brought sugar into Europe. So what happened was, because you see, you can't grow sugar in Europe because sugar needs a tropical climate. Sugar cane, you see? So what is happening is that sugar and sweets are being brought here. The Europeans never ate this before. They never had food that we done the spices and things for the food. So what happens is that they get hooked on sugar, but they can't get enough of it. So they decide to go, see, cotton didn't get us in trouble. Sugar did. That's the first product of the slave trade, was sugar. So what happens is a lively trade occurs here.
Led by the Italian explorer Christopher Columbus, the Niña de Pinta and the Santa Maria set sail from Palos de la Frontera, Spain. Columbus arrived to the Caribbean and explored the region in 4 voyages. In his second voyage, he arrived to Puerto Rico. Columbus first arrived in the West Indies. He was amazed to encounter the Taínos. He described them in his journal as of short stature, with long, lustrous black hair, tan skin, and healthy, robust bodies. He called them Indians, believing them to be natives of India. These were the first people to feel the devastating effects of this New World encounter.
So when Christopher Columbus and them, when they found the Caribbean island, they found Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, they found, South America and all this, they enslaved the indigenous people there. They enslaved who we call Indians. They enslaved the Indians, the indigenous tribal people. They enslaved the Taíno, the Arawak.
In 1508, the Spanish would eventually set up the second colony of the Americas, which they named San Juan Bautista, known today as Puerto Rico. The Spaniards worked the Taínos tediously, leaving few to harvest their own food, causing starvation and famine. Their wages were minimal, and many were worked to death. In many other cases, women were raped and mistreated. As a result, many of the natives preferred to commit suicide instead of dealing with this harsh way of life.
And from my understanding, this is the birth of Puerto Ricans. This is how Puerto Ricans as we know them, this is how they started. And the same thing with Dominicans. This is how a lot of Dominicans started. From when the Europeans came and had sex with indigenous people of the land, whether it was rape or sex or whatever. And they spread diseases and all kinds of stuff. And then the Tainos started dying off. The Native Americans started dying off.
If not by exploitation, they would die of disease. The Tainos were vulnerable to old world diseases since they did not have immunity to them. Throughout the island, illnesses spread rapidly, such as smallpox, chickenpox, and measles, killing thousands of native population.
That's where chickenpox come from. Chickenpox come from humans living in the close proximity to chickens. And breathing the same air creates, over time, creates a disease within, which becomes communicable.
Imagine catching chickenpox for the very first time and you never was exposed or have no knowledge of chickenpox. And this is my understanding. The Taino and the indigenous tribal people in America, in the islands, they never saw chickenpox. They never saw these diseases, these germs that the Caucasians had with them. Remember, like I said, the Caucasians was known in their history to have intimacy with animals. So they had all kinds of germs, generational germs. From generation to generation, they just always had sexual diseases. And they brought these diseases to Puerto Rico. They brought these diseases to Haiti. This is not even African-American slavery yet. This is how Puerto Ricans was put in slavery. This is why Puerto Ricans got Spanish names. This is why Dominicans got Spanish names.
As populations dwindled by 30 years after the encounter, more than a third of all Tainos had perished. As more settlers arrived to the Spanish colony, they intermixed with the female natives. The Spanish, for the most part, did not bring their families. They came in search of gold and adventure. They began to intermix with Taino women, which was very typical throughout the Spanish colonies. A recent island-wide DNA study by Dr. Juan Martinez Cruzado revealed that the Taino ancestry is much more present among modern-day Puerto Ricans than previously believed. It was assumed that the Taino were extinct, whereas now some historians understand that this might be false.
So from my understanding, the Native Americans started dying off. These Catholic Europeans speaking Spanish and Portuguese, went back to Africa with their old friendship and their trading partners. They went back to Africa and they made deals with the African chiefs. And from my understanding, like I said, the African tribes was already in conflict. Before the Europeans even got there, the African tribes was already in conflict. And what they would do is they would put their rivals as servants. And from my understanding, they was trading their rivals to various parts of West Africa. This was already going on before Europeans even came there.
The first Europeans who came to Ghana were the Portuguese, and they arrived in 1471. And when they got here, they found that there was a brisk trade in slaves between Ghana and its West African neighbors. And for 100 years, Portugal remained on the coast of Ghana and took part in this coastal trade.
Slaves were also acquired as captives of Africa's wars. Europeans had long been part of an established system for bartering them.
So from my understanding, when the Europeans came back and they made deals with the African chiefs to use some of the Africans as servants in the newfound America. They just found America. So when they brought the original Africans over, the Africans was brought to Puerto Rico and the Africans was brought to Dominican Republic, Haiti.
The slave owners in the West Indies, they preferred slaves from the Gold Coast because they said these were very hard-working, hardy slaves.
The Africans was brought to Puerto Rico and the Africans was brought to Dominican Republic, Haiti. From my understanding, this is why a lot of Dominicans are basically African, or brown-skinned, woolly hair.
Are Dominicans black? Dominicans can be black. Dominicans typically have European, African, and Native American ancestry. All three.
So from my understanding, before Europeans brought Africans to America, they first brought Africans to Puerto Rico. They first brought Africans to Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Brazil.
A lot of history lessons about slavery focus on the experience of African slaves who were shipped to the United States. But an estimated 4.5 million African slaves were sold to Brazil. That's 10 times the number as went to North America. And today, more than 80% of the population of the northeastern state of Bahia is descended from African slaves.
From my understanding, the first Africans that were sold in the transatlantic slavery was not African American. They came to Dominican Republic, Haiti, Brazil, Honduras, Central America, the Caribbean islands, Puerto Rico. That's why some Puerto Ricans are African with woolly hair.
De la niñez en Puerto Rico vive bajo niveles de pobreza. Y vemos que las comunidades afrodescendientes, esto es un número que sobrepasa el 60%.
Puerto Rico, puertorriqueños, necesitamos de ustedes. Lleguen a Puerto Rico, todo lo que puedan aportarle económicamente o como sea, la ayuda que sea. Puerto Rico lo necesita a todos ustedes. Vamos hacia adelante.
I am often asked what I am, usually by African Americans who are lighter than me and by Latinos who are darker. To answer that question, I say now, I'm a Black Boricua, Black Rican, Puerto Riqueña. Being Black in America is my racial identity. So to me, being Black is not just a skin color, nor is it synonymous with African Americans only, nor is it synonymous with African Americans only.
And this is why some Puerto Ricans are brown-skinned woolly hair, because they brought the first Africans. They made deals as servants. They made deals with the African chiefs to bring some Africans and use them as servants. Like I said, some Puerto Ricans identify with their African genetics, and that's cool, but let's not be bamboozled and thinking that all Latinos are African genetics, because that's not true.
Let's speak about Latinos not being Black. Latinos are Black.
Yes, some Latinos are African genetics, but not all Latinos would agree with Fat Joe at all. A lot of Latinos do not identify with African genetics because some of them may resemble or lean towards their Spanish European ancestors. Some Latinos will tell you, when people tell you who they are, believe them. And when you got Puerto Ricans or Latinos that tell you they're not Black and they're not African, believe them, and that's cool. It shouldn't be a problem. We shouldn't have to try to force people to be Black or be African genetics. They are who they are. Embrace, accept people for who they are. So if they lean towards their Spanish Caucasian side, that's cool. It is what it is.
Hi, I'm Kayla. As you guys saw by the title, I did do a ancestry DNA test. I am of Puerto Rican descent. According to Ancestry.com, I have 29% from Portugal, 23% from Spain, so that is 52% from the Iberian Peninsula, which, like I said, guys, I already knew that was gonna, like, to be honest, I already knew.
People tell you who they are, believe them. You know what I'm saying? Because it's a mixed bag, and that's where all the confusion comes from, because you got a lot of mixed genetics here. In Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, you got a lot of mixed genetics. Some Dominicans and Puerto Ricos are straight. You could look at them and you could tell they're just straight African genetics. But some of them are not. Some of them are more European genetics, and some of them are probably more Native American genetics. So it's a little confusion, but from my understanding, when you actually go to Puerto Rico and talk to the actual people, most of the people in Puerto Rico do not call themselves Black or African, do not identify themselves as Black or African. I saw the film, video, documentary. The lady in the video said only 8% of Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico identify themselves as Black. Only 8% of the total population identifies themselves as Black. The brown-skinned woolly-haired lady also said that racism is a denied problem in Puerto Rico.
Sabemos que el problema del racismo es un problema súper negado en Puerto Rico y lo podemos ver hasta desde el censo. Lamentablemente solamente un 8% de la población, estamos hablando de 300,000 personas, se autoidentifican como negros y negras.
And by the way, the island was called Borequén. It wasn't called Puerto Rico. From my understanding, the natives, they called it Borequén or Boricua. That's what they called their land. It wasn't called Puerto Rico yet. So from my understanding, when they brought the Africans, they brought them to Puerto Rico, they brought them to the Dominican Republic. And from my understanding, the only reason why European Caucasians was able to pull it off, because Africans was catching rival Africans and they was bringing them to the Caribbean islands.
Wherever we go in the world, they do not have the powers or the number to overtake us. They exploit us fighting each other. And that's been their history. They don't have the power. We give them the power. In fact, the more powerful they become is the more power that we give them.
Because if we really analyze them for what they really were, we would know they are not what they pretend to be.
From my understanding, the Africans disliked the other Africans so much that the Europeans didn't even have to go inland to catch the Africans and put them in servitude. From my understanding, it was the Africans actually bringing them out. It was the Africans catching the Africans, bringing them out to the shore for the Europeans to put in the ship. That is so deep. Like, the Europeans didn't even have to go and catch them. I know in the movie, and even in this film, Roots, you see one European standing by while like 3 or 4 Africans catch the African. From my understanding, from what I hear these people saying, they're saying Africans were the ones that was bringing them, doing all of the catching, and Europeans would sit and wait for the Africans to bring them out.
The Europeans themselves did not go inland to the villages or to the town to capture slaves. They remained at the forts and the castles. And it was the African traders who sold the slaves to the Europeans. Now, what happened was that there were middlemen who would meet the inland traders bringing the slaves. They would buy these slaves and then in turn resold them to the European merchants in the castles.
The African role in the transatlantic slave trade must not be swept under the carpet. The greed factor was there. Kingdoms made money. They rose as a result of the trade. Big, powerful people, rich families were created as a result of the Africans who were active collaborators in the trade.
So this is what I'm saying about conflict. The Africans disliked each other so much that the Europeans didn't even have to catch the Africans. The Africans was just gladly selling other Africans. From my understanding, this was big business in Africa. Big business. Africans selling rival Africans was big business.
In the 17th century, the Atlantic slave trade became the most important activity on the coast. We find that almost every town, coastal town, and almost every European fort and castle was involved in slave trading. So we have about 65 slave markets in Ghana alone.
Rival European powers were building castles to protect their cargoes. Within a century, there would be a fort every 3 miles on what used to be called the Gold Coast. It came to be known as the Slave Coast. The image we have today of the slave trade as mass kidnap by Europeans couldn't be further from the truth. For both sides, this was just business. The transatlantic slave trade dominated West Africa. For some kingdoms, selling slaves became an economic necessity.
You know, for me, analyzing the transatlantic enslavement and the Africans and everything and how everything happened reminds me so much of the golden era in hip-hop. And I'm just as guilty as anyone else. In the past, in the, the 90s, back in the golden era, I was in the street rhyming and everything, battle rhyming and everything. So I'm just as guilty as anyone else. Verbally attacking other brown-skinned, woolly-haired people. Competition. They would give some of us a lot of money. They would give a lot of us wealth to talk greasy to the rest of us. It's the basic same thing. How much of hip-hop is based on brown-skinned, woolly-haired conflict? A lot of hip-hop. Think of all of the songs in hip-hop we say is classic songs based on conflict, hurting each other.
So, in a way, or to a large extent, the slave trade depended, I think, heavily on the conflicts between the local African peoples. The slave trade depended, I think, heavily on the conflicts between the local African peoples.
It is the same thing in hip-hop. A lot of hip-hop is big business based on brown-skinned, woolly-haired people and verbal conflict. Big business based on brown-skinned, woolly-haired people and conflict. Brown-skinned, woolly-haired people verbally attacking each other. It's basically the same thing, except it's just verbal. It's not physical, but it's verbal. But if you can verbally attack someone, and if you verbally conflict with someone, and you're just a step away from physically attacking someone, you're just a step away from physical conflict with someone.
The traders hit upon a new strategy. Wars between African nations always meant captives for sale, so the slavers supplied arms to some nations and encouraged their kings to wage war on vulnerable neighbors. The slave traders had started an arms race in Africa. They never gave any African nation enough weaponry to challenge European power, but the gun served to keep Africans fighting each other for a century.
big business based on brown-skinned, woolly-haired people and verbal conflict. They would give some of us a lot of money to talk greasy to the rest of us. It's the basic same thing. You give me a lot of wealth to talk greasy to my brothers, talk greasy to my brothers on a record.
The traders hit upon a new strategy. Wars between African nations always meant captives for sale. Wars between African nations always meant captives for sale. So the slavers supplied arms to some nations and encouraged their kings to wage war on vulnerable neighbors.
And that's basically what's going on in hip-hop. You know what I'm saying? I'm just as guilty as anybody else back in the 90s, making hip-hop directed towards verbally attacking my brothers. Whether it's verbally or physically, even though slave trade was physical and it was serious, but it's the same basic thing. This is how we did it. Back in the our beloved golden era of hip-hop. Instead of physically attacking our brother, now it's verbal. Everything is verbal attack in hip-hop. And I'm just as guilty as anybody else, verbally attacking my brother. And a lot of us, we get paid to verbally attack and to sound greasy. Battle, we always in battle mode. Some people say that's what hip-hop is, battle.
They exploit us fighting each other. They exploit us fighting each other. They exploit us fighting each other. And that's been their history. They don't have the power. We give them the power. In fact, the more powerful they become is the more power that we give them. Because if we really analyze them for what they really were, we would know they are not what they pretend to be.
You know, from my understanding, the Africans had a servitude, but their servitude was not like American slavery. So from my understanding, when the Africans was trading or selling the Africans, their rival Africans to the Caribbean, they thought that they were selling them for servitude, like, because in African servitude, you would be a servant for a certain amount of time and then you would be let free. Your children wouldn't be born as servants or slaves, so your children wouldn't be in bondage.
In the indigenous system, especially in Ghana, no slave owner had the power of life and death over the slave. But in the castle, you could do anything to the slave. You could kill the slave, you could maim the slave, you could mutilate the slave, you could punish the slave as you liked.
You know what I'm saying? From my understanding, African slavery was different. You were just servitude, you was a servant for a certain amount of time. So from my understanding, the agreement that the Africans gave with the Spanish and Portuguese and even the English was that the Africans would be a servant or slave for a certain amount of time. They wouldn't be in bondage for the rest of their life, and then their children in bondage and generational bondage. From my understanding, that the Africans didn't look at it the same way. They didn't know what they was doing. They didn't know what they was getting their rival Africans into. The way they looked at it, to my understanding, was different.
Slavery existed in societies that had no prison systems. It was part of the punitive measures against criminal conduct, criminal behavior. The slaves lost their liberty. They went away, maybe into the neighboring state or the neighboring nation, but only for a season. It was not a long-term loss of liberty. And the children of the slaves, of course, were never slaves in that context.
So, from my understanding, after Spain and Portugal, other European nations started getting involved with this human trafficking, with this triangular trade. England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, collectively known as Britain, France, and Caucasians from the Netherlands, Holland. Sometimes they called the Dutch. There's a very interesting documentary about the Africans that was brought in Jamaica, about the Africans that was brought to England. And I guess this would include like Moni Love's ancestors and Lennox Lewis' ancestors. They talk about the Africans that was brought to England.
The company found that African kings were just as greedy as England's own royal family. They were willing to supply exactly what the plantations needed.
From my understanding, most or a lot or many of the Africans that they was trading was actual teenagers and maybe like young adults, but the majority of them was teenagers that they were selling, young boys and young girls to work the fields of sugar, tobacco, and coffee.
In any event, black people were still for sale in England.
To be sold, a healthy Negro slave named Prince, 17 years of age, measuring 5 feet.
Within 2 generations, his heir, John Pinney, was meticulously recording the purchase of African slaves for his booming plantations, including one he named Pero Jones.
I desire you to take the earliest opportunity of buying me 10 new Negroes. Never let them be younger than 10 years, and never let them be as old as 30 if you can help it. Never let them be younger than 10 years, and never let them be as old as 30 if you can help it. Get them at St.
Run away sometime since, a Negro lad about 18 years of age, answers to the name of Starling, now the property of Ralph Cook at the sign of the Rising Sun in Princes Street, Bristol.
Have you forgotten that once we were brought here, we were robbed of our names, robbed of our language?
So, from my understanding, most, if not all of us, we was called blacks and Negroes. Regardless of our tribal identity, during the 1600s and 1700s, the triangular trade, this human trafficking was in full swing. We was called blacks and Negroes by the Europeans who was trying to enslave us. And whatever name France and Portugal had for African, I'm not 100% certain of what France called the Africans and what Portugal called the Africans that was in Brazil. So, from my understanding, we wasn't allowed to claim a tribal identity, and at the same time we wasn't allowed to claim a nationality. So it was like we were stuck in between no tribal identity and no nationality. We were stuck in this black Negro matrix. So from my understanding, they called us black and Negroes in England, they called us black and Negroes in the Caribbean islands, they called us black and Negroes in parts of South America, they called us black and Negroes in parts of Central America.
It is universally admitted that the black force in the West Indies should be augmented.
Yet in England in the 1700s, black slaves were seldom more than a...
Whoever shall harbour or conceal the said black will be prosecuted.
To be sold, a healthy Negro slave named Prince.
I am truly sorry to hear that the Negroes have not behaved as they ought.
Black people were still for sale in England.
The first Negro received 365 lashes. Mr. Huggins gave another Negro man 115. And that should Mr. Wilberforce's plan for the prohibition of a further importation of Negroes into our islands take place...
By the 1770s, there were up to 15,000 black people in England's cities.
Let the black go free.
Guide you out of triple stage darkness. When it get dark again, then I'ma spark this.
One of the reasons why I think Europeans called us black is to mean dumb and unaware. Like for instance, when you step out in nature, 4 o'clock in the morning, you're gonna be surrounded with nothing but blackness. You're gonna be unaware. When you're surrounded with blackness at night, you're unaware of your surroundings. If you don't have a light, you're gonna struggle for awareness. You're gonna be unaware of what's around you. And I think that's part of the reason why Caucasians called us black, to keep us dumb, to keep us deaf, dumb, and blind, to keep us unaware. When our ancestors started to become more conscious and more aware of the English language, when they started to learn how to read and write English, it was easier for our ancestors to rebel. They started to pass messages around and rebel. We had different revolutions and revolts just by us becoming more aware and conscious of the English language. That's when they came with the Negro Act, when they made it illegal for us to read or to write or whatever, however that went.
You're the only people who was not allowed to learn by law?
That caused them to say, well, you know what? We need laws against this. We can't have the Africans reading or writing. We can't have them playing the drum. We can't have them owning land. So because of the 1740 slave codes that now prevented people of African descent from reading and writing, because they could before that,
it made it a crime for African Americans to learn certain things. To my understanding, that's part of the reason why they called us black, to keep us not knowing, to keep us unaware. You step in blackness, you're unaware of your surroundings.
From unconsciousness to consciousness, from unconsciousness to consciousness.
So from my understanding, there was hundreds of revolts and rebellions that they don't really tell us about.
People say, well, if slavery was so brutal, why were there not more slave rebellions? In fact, scholars have now documented literally hundreds of rebellions that previously we didn't know about. Scholars have now documented literally hundreds of rebellions that previously we didn't know about.
The fact of the matter is that slavery ended because of slave rebellions, and because it was no longer politically and economically viable.
So from my understanding, our African-American ancestors had hundreds of revolts and rebellions that they don't tell us about. And this is decades before Nat Turner, decades before the Haitian Revolution. This is way before all of that. Like, from my understanding, they had a big revolt in New York City.
When fires erupted in a number of other buildings, warehouses, and stores, it was clear that this was more than romance thwarted.
The cry went up. The Negroes are rising, the Negroes are rising.
The fact of the matter is that slavery ended because of slave rebellions, and because it was no longer politically and economically viable. No one felt bad and ended slavery. It wasn't ended because of moral guilt or because of collective guilt.
There's a little list of them. If you look online, you'll find a little small list of them. But from my understanding, it was more than just that. From my understanding, it was hundreds of them. And some may look at these rebellions as some kind of failure. You know, like when they show Nat Turner getting lynched or killed, but it depends on how you look at it, because see, from my understanding, it was because of the accumulation of them. Like, from my understanding, after a while, you have too many rebellions, it just becomes like not even worth it. Like the Caucasian and Europeans, they started getting real paranoid, worried, scared of the brown-skinned, woolly-haired people uprising. And from my understanding, they even had a big conspiracy. You know, in New York, it was called the New York Conspiracy, where they were so paranoid and scared that they started killing our people just because they thought it was a plot.
Even when you look at rebellions that were really just rumors, the response was so violent. Hundreds of people would be imprisoned or lynched as a result of the suspicion of a rebellion.
They were so paranoid and scared that they felt like they had to kill a whole bunch of our people. So my point is, we shouldn't look at it as they all failed. They didn't fail because the accumulation of them, you know, they had to change the rules up. They had to change things up, transform their system.
The fact of the matter is that slavery ended because of slave rebellions.
Oh, I done done, I done done what you told me to do.
In 1739, due to the Stoner Rebellion that took place in South Carolina, one of the largest planned insurrections, as they call it, of African people.
So from my understanding, the Stonewall Rebellion was one of the biggest African-American rebellions. And also, you know, you got the Seminole tribe. That was a runaway tribe, from my understanding. They was involved with these rebellions, the Seminole tribe. You know, it was rebellions all over the Caribbean, rebellions all over South America, Central America. From my understanding, Jamaica had it rough. From my understanding, they had it real rough on the slave plantations in Jamaica.
In the Caribbean, they had seasoning plantations, which were plantations used to break the slaves. And one plantation, or one place that had a lot of seasoning plantations, was Jamaica. And people have to wonder, what were they doing on these seasoning plantations that was worse than what was happening on the regular plantations? Well, one thing that they were doing on these plantations, especially in Jamaica, they were doing a process called buck breaking, where the white supremacist slave owner or the white supremacist overseer would literally rape black men in front of the whole black population in order to break his spirit, in order to break him down as a man, in order to show dominance against him, in order to show the rest of the black population that this is not your leader. I just made your leader submit to me sexually. And this happened a lot in Jamaica. This is why homosexuality is so looked down upon in Jamaican culture today.
The question on the table is, in what ways does slavery still affect the Jamaican society today?
My interest in him is regarding my name. My name is Robert Beckford. William Beckford and his father, Alderman Beckford, slaves on their plantations in Jamaica.
Jamaica had, you know, slave plantations. From my understanding, they had rebellions in Jamaica, and a lot of it was put down harshly.
In the Caribbean, slaves now outnumbered whites 10 to 1, but white rule offered no room for rebellion.
There's a law which says if a slave raises his hand to hit a white man, he can have his hand amputated. This was the sort of regulation that you actually had. These laws were now being passed directly by the Jamaican House of Assembly, which was dominated by planters.
Rebellions were put down by the superior force of the colonial militias. The slaves saw Huggins for what he was. They began to run away, first one by one, then in groups. Huggins had them caught and brought them back to the market square for a public flogging.
The first Negro received 365 lashes. Mr. Huggins gave another Negro man 115 lashes, and to a woman 110 lashes. The woman who received 291 lashes appeared young and was most cruelly flogged.
The flogging took so long that the drivers had to alternate laying the lashes on because it was too much for one man to do, in spite of the fact he was quite strong. 2 days later, the woman died of natural causes, according to the coroner, and the man was crippled for life and lived only a few years afterwards.
So from my understanding, Jamaica had its great soldiers who stood up during slavery also. Like how, you know, us African Americans, we have Nat Turner. They have their heroes who stood up in slavery.
Jamaica's national hero, Sam Sharp, began the island's most momentous uprising, planned on a Beckford plantation. Sharp was an unlikely rebel, a trusted slave, literate, numerate, and a Baptist minister. In December 1831, Sharp used his weekly prayer meetings to urge the slaves to go on strike, but the moderate action he planned soon spiraled out of control. Groups of slaves broke curfew and set fire to whole plantations.
They began to burn estates over a wide area.
The revolt was doomed. 14 planters were killed, but hundreds of slaves died in the militia's reprisals.
They were ill-equipped to fight a war. Many of them did not know how to use firearms. Sharp decided that if he were the main cause, then maybe he could stop the killing by giving himself up.
Sharp was tried as a ringleader. A planters' court found him guilty. He was sentenced to be hanged in the square which now bears his name.
So from my understanding, Jamaica also had rebellions also. But, you know, it was a group, from my understanding, it was a group of Jamaicans who fled away into the mountains, and they was able to fend off and fight off the Europeans from the mountains. They call them the Maroons. But of course, the greatest rebellion, they actually won. They actually, you know, overturned and won and kicked out the Europeans out off their island and fought back and took over, was of course the Haitian Revolution.
And Haiti is the only nation where a slave population rose up and took over.
The African people on the island fought all the largest armies of the world at the time and won over each one of them. Whooped the Spaniards, beat up the French, knocked down the British.
In this new documentary film, we're going to discuss how this little tiny nation of Africans defeated some of the biggest Western powers in the world to gain their independence in 1804.
So from my understanding, Haiti was the first to end the transatlantic enslavement, and they became an independent sovereign nation since 1804. And slavery slowly ended during the 1800s. Slavery ended in different nations in different years, but basically during the 1800s, the transatlantic enslavement was over. From my understanding, a lot of these nations in the Caribbean, in South America, Central America, they became colonies. They became colonies of England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, collectively known as Britain. To my understanding, in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, most of the Caribbean islands started becoming independent. From my understanding, independence meaning they no longer had to pay taxes to England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, or Spain and Portugal. My understanding of an independent nation means that you're self-governing. You govern yourself. My understanding of an independent nation is a nation that has its own money.
He got his own money. And baby, when I tell you he's got his own money, I mean the boy has got his own money.
They have money with their faces on it. They have money with their heroes' faces on it. They govern themselves on their own territory. So from my understanding, they was independent since the 60s, 70s, and 80s. From my understanding, Jamaica's actually independent. Barbados is actually independent. Most of the Caribbean islands is independent from my understanding. I want to salute and show respect to all of the Caribbean islands. You know what I'm saying? They're independent. Most of them independent. You know, gotta respect it, gotta salute that. Independent, they govern themselves. Understanding the only group around us that, you know, is in our neighborhoods that are not independent nations, that don't come from independent nations, is Puerto Ricans. From my understanding, Puerto Ricans actually voted to stay a Commonwealth. They voted to stay dependent on the United States of America. And to me, that's very interesting. And to me, that's powerful. And you got that choice to vote. You know, I wish us African Americans would have a vote to become independent or not. You know what I'm saying? So at least, you know, they voted to stay dependent upon America.
The Caribbean island of Puerto Rico is an unincorporated territory or commonwealth of the United States. This basically means its status is somewhere between being a state and being an independent nation. Puerto Rico officially became a commonwealth in 1948, and ever since, the future of Puerto Rico's status has been up for debate. Should it stay a commonwealth, become an American state, or become an independent nation? 3 separate votes to answer that question have happened on the island in 1967, 1993, and 1998, and they all reaffirmed Puerto Rico's Commonwealth status.
So respect to all the descendants of the transatlantic enslavement, especially those nations who found their way to independence. And from my understanding, they did it peacefully. When it looks to me, when I research it, I didn't find any wars. You know, as far as Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad. From my understanding, these nations, they became independent without physical war with Caucasians, without physical war with Europeans.
On the stroke of midnight, our own national flag, red, white, and black, rose gracefully to the top, marking the attainment of freedom. August 31st, 1962. And here in the Red House, all are gathered to witness the official ceremony marking the inauguration of the first Parliament for independent Trinidad and Tobago.
In 1967, Antigua became the first Eastern Caribbean island to receive the associated statehood constitution from Britain that gave internal self-government, but with London remaining responsible for foreign policy and defense. However, he wanted full independence, and when he won the election again in 1980, this was a major plank of his campaign. In the presence of Princess Margaret appearing on behalf of her sister Queen Elizabeth II, the instruments of state were presented to the new Prime Minister, Vere Cornwall Byrd Sr., who led the country to full independence on Sunday, November 1, 1981, when the flag of the new nation of Antigua and Barbuda was raised for the first time as the country became a full sovereign and independent state.
The next step for him was independence. Under Alvaro's leadership in 1966, Barbados was declared independent and had a massive celebration which was to be remembered for decades to come.
This is a very proud moment in the history of the people of Barbados.
The British flag, which has flown over Jamaica for the past 3 centuries, is about to be replaced by the Jamaica national flag, heralding the birth of the new nation. The lights go out. The Union Jack is lowered and the new flag of Jamaica raised.
Present!
300
200 years of British government had come to an end. And peacefully, one more nation had been helped to achieve its yearning for self-government. All wish well to the happy people of independent Jamaica.
But like I say, a lot of these other nations like Jamaica, Barbados, Antigua, they became independent by negotiating. At least that's from my understanding, that's what it looks like. When I research it online, it looks like they negotiated their independence. And they became independent and they self-governing, they govern themselves. So gotta salute that. That's not saying that they don't have problems, that they don't have issues. Of course they have problems and they have issues. That's not to say these independent nations don't have serious challenges for their future. Life on Earth is meant to be a challenge. Life on Earth is meant to be a challenge to be solved. But my understanding is about challenges. And that's something that I want to give thanks to the Nation of Islam, whether it be Farrakhan or Elijah Muhammad. I give them thanks for learning that lesson. You know, that's a lesson I learned, that life, you know what I'm saying? Life is all about overcoming challenges. From the sperm is a challenge.
Sperm is the root of us all. But the sperm was placed in a hostile environment. The vaginal tract of the female is not conducive for the life of the sperm. If the sperm could talk, the sperm would say, man, I got a rough job here. I gotta swim in a hostile environment. And there's 100 million other dudes in here with me that has the same objective in mind. And I got to get to this egg before everybody else, or I'm out of here. Sperm is saying, if sperm could talk, it would be saying, I got to take the uphill road, swim against gravity to get to this egg.
So from my understanding, how I took that lesson is that we're supposed to win over our challenges in life. We're supposed to solve our issues in life. We're supposed to have a solution for our challenges in life. Whether as an individual, as a family, as a community, as a nation, we're supposed to win over our challenges. We're always going to be faced with small challenges on your day-to-day life, your day-to-day walk, your path through life. We're always going to face small challenges, and we're supposed to win over those challenges. That's the message I took from it. And also that the answers to our challenge is usually right in front of our face. The answers to our, issues in life is usually right in front of our face. It's just a matter of seeing it and putting things together.
There is no problem that we suffer from that there is not a solution for that problem. Lying right in the problem is the solution.
So it's understandable for Caribbean nations, South American nations, or Central American nations to have issues. A lot of these nations haven't even been independent for 100 years yet. So of course it's understandable that they have issues.
The question on the table is, in what ways does slavery still affect the Jamaican society today? One of the major ways is still the power differential between class and color. We talk a lot about people and we say, why watch them a bleach themselves? Them not love themselves. Why them a bleach themselves? And I say we have to get to the real issue, because nobody know the things when I help where them not think I gonna be positive. If when me a bleach, it not get me nowhere further than when me never a bleach. People not gonna just wholesale, just a bleach.
Yeah.
So we have to ask ourselves in this society, what is it about color that we still use?
The Chinese pretty much own Jamaica. I mean, the Jamaican government is giving them concessions, land concessions. They're building hotels, beach resorts. They're building 2 schools for the Japanese.
Well done, Mr. Politician Man. I must congratulate you. Done a wonderful job at tear down with country demolition, man. Skibbly bang, well done, Mr. Politician Man. You done such a great job selling out the country with your business plan. What kind of plan? Which is to keep poverty and unemployment on the rise. Corruption and not to...
So from my understanding, it's by choice now. Being an independent nation, and now is your choice whether you do business with Europeans, whether you do business with Chinese or whatever. So if Jamaican politicians are selling out their people, or if Jamaican politicians are doing whatever they're doing with China, that's by choice. So, a lot of these other nationalities, they're independent, they govern themselves, and I gotta salute that. And a lot of them, from my understanding, they didn't have to fight and kill to get independent. You know, there's certain issues that we all deal with as human beings, regardless of your nationality, regardless of your ethnic background. There's certain issues that we all deal with, whether it's envy, ego, pride, lust, maybe greed, gluttony. There's certain things that we all got to deal with as human beings, certain issues. But then there's another set of issues that it seems like brown-skinned, woolly-haired people deal with all around the world, whether you're brown-skinned, woolly hair in Africa, brown-skinned, woolly hair in South America, whether you're in Central America, brown-skinned, woolly hair in the Caribbean. There's certain issues that we deal with as brown-skinned, woolly-haired people, and that got to do with discrimination. We get discriminated against, and we get discriminated against sometimes by our own people, meaning, like, for instance, in South America, you might have some flesh color people who discriminate against the brown color people in their own nation. From my understanding, in Brazil, you have that issue where the flesh color Brazilians discriminate against the brown color Brazilians.
Brazil, one of the most racially mixed countries on the planet. Half the population has African origins, yet black and mixed race people suffer real discrimination, and it happens in politics. Claudette Alves is the only black woman with a seat on São Paulo's city council. In this assembly, of the 50 delegates, only 2 are black. This is very symbolic.
We have an apartheid system here. Not an official one like in South Africa. But this apartheid exists and is hidden from view. It's very real. We can feel it. The only ones who notice it are the ones with black skin. It's still said around the world that we live in a racial democracy here. But this is not true.
All the socio-economic indexes related to education, employment and health show disadvantages for the Afro-descendants. Half of the 50 million poor people here are from the black community, so the population can feel the inequality.
From my understanding, it's like that all around the world. Like anywhere you go where it's flesh color people and brown skin color people, the flesh color seem to discriminate against the brown skin, woolly haired people. And from my understanding, it's like that in Dominican Republic.
They despise us because we're black. But we aren't Haitians, we're Dominicans. Our children want to prosper, but they won't give us the papers.
Discrimination against Haitian guest workers and their children goes back to the days of former dictator Rafael Trujillo. In 1937, almost 40,000 Haitians were massacred in a campaign to whiten the Dominican Republic's mixed blood population. The biggest irony is that almost everyone in this country has an ancestor that came here from Africa as a slave to cut sugarcane, like this. But it's an ancestry that many would just as soon forget.
Anyone who is very black is discriminated against in this society that admires lighter skin and straight, soft hair. Do you know what they call me?
Rubia.
A blonde.
It's not a black and white matter. In the Dominican Republic, it's all about shade. The lighter, the sweeter the sound. The darker, the tougher the prospects.
All around the world, wherever is a nation where you have flesh color people living amongst brown skin people, the flesh color seem to always want to dominate and want to discriminate against the brown skin, woolly haired people. From my understanding, Puerto Rico is already, a very poor nation. And from what the lady says, brown skin, woolly haired Puerto Ricans are even more poor. They face more poverty. The Puerto Rican lady in the video speaks about systemic inequality in Puerto Rico.
Antes de María, nosotros, ¿verdad? Lamentablemente nuestras comunidades vivían en pobreza. El 58% de la niñez en Puerto Rico vive bajo niveles de pobreza. Y vemos que las comunidades afrodescendientes, esto es un número que sobrepasa el 60%. Vemos el factor de desigualdad. Si miramos el caso de Loíza, que puede ser el caso de muchas comunidades en Puerto Rico, hay un problema de acceso a oportunidades para nuestra niñez y juventud, ¿verdad? Hay muchas organizaciones a nivel comunitaria, tanto como Boys and Girls Club, Taller Salud y otras comunidades que están trabajando diariamente para aportar al proceso educativo, al proceso de que nuestros jóvenes, nuestras familias reconozcan procesos de desigualdad, ellos se apoderen.
From my understanding, a lot of this discrimination and confusion started with the Transatlantic enslavement. That's when a lot of us took on this black identity and identified Europeans as white. To me, all of this discrimination and prejudice basically stems from the identification of white. Whenever us indigenous people break out of the illusion of seeing these people as white, a lot of this brown skin inferiority complex will end. It's when we start seeing these people as they really are, which is flesh color human beings.
The flesh tone color wheel allows you to see color theory in skin tone.
I like to think of the flesh tone color wheel as a game board, and there are two ways to start playing. First one is to find your skin on the wheel. How do you do that? Well, you can kind of hold it up and spin it around until you find the color closest to you.
The same flesh color that's underneath your nail, that's their skin color. And when we start seeing them as what they truly are, a lot of this brown skin inferiority complex will end. So the original point was that even though many of the brown-skinned, woolly-haired people who came out to transatlantic enslavement became independent nations, they still have issues within their own nation still to be solved. But, you know, you always got to salute their long road to independence. You know, they came a long way. I mean, from the 1500s to the 1800s, to my understanding, we was all known as Negroes. So it was Negroes in the Caribbean, it was Negroes in South America, it was Negroes in Central America, and it was Negroes here in the United States. We was all classified as blacks and Negroes, to my understanding, Moreno. So from my understanding, after the transatlantic enslavement was legally abolished, the black and Negroes in the Caribbean, they took on their national name as their primary identity. The black and Negroes in South America, they took on their national name as their primary identity. The black and Negroes in Central America took on their national name as their primary identity. They dropped the black Negro identity and they took on their national name. So from my understanding, after slavery was abolished, the African descendants in Haiti, they became known as Haitians. The African descendants in Jamaica, they became known as Jamaicans. The African descendants in Dominican Republic, they became known as Dominicans. The African descendants in Puerto Rico became known as Puerto Ricans. The African descendants in Antigua, Trinidad, all of the islands, they became known as their national name. Same thing from my understanding, same thing with Central America and South America. Brazil, the African descendants of Brazil became known as Brazilians. The African descendants in Panama became known as Panamanians. The African descendants of Honduras became known as Hondurians, so on and so forth. From my understanding, all of the islands from Cuba, they became known as Cubans. All of the islands, the African descendants, wherever they was, they dropped the black Negro identity and they picked up their national name. When slavery ended, black and Negro was no longer their primary identity. It was no longer their primary name. So in comparison with us African Americans, we kept the black Negro identity as our primary identity even after slavery ended. So all through the Black Wall Street days, the Black Panthers, the Black Spades, we kept the black Negro identity from slavery and actually tried to have pride in being black. And while we was in the middle of our civil rights struggle, you know, our civil rights movement, our Black Power movement, Lyndon Johnson, who was president at the time, he signed the Immigration Act or Immigration Agreement that allowed a lot of other ethnic groups in. 1965, Lyndon Johnson signs this immigration agreement. Large populations of other ethnic groups starts coming into the United States. Whereas before it was only one or two West Indians, now it's large populations of West Indians. One or two Puerto Ricans turns into large populations of Latino. It's Dominicans, it's Honduras, it's Panamanians. Everything begins to change as Lyndon Johnson, but it happens gradually.
Congress passed and President Johnson signed into law the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965. This act profoundly changed the flow of people coming into America. It did away with a quota system that had been in place since the 1920s. That quota system used race and national origin as the primary determining factors for whether a person would be allowed to immigrate to the U.S. It heavily favored people from Northern and Western Europe and severely restricted Asian and African immigrants. The new rules opened America's doors to new categories of immigrants. Middle Eastern, Asian, and African immigrants were now able to come to the U.S. and put down roots here. From 1965 to 1970, immigration from Asian countries, especially Vietnam and Cambodia, quadrupled. By the end of the 20th century, 4.3 million Mexican immigrants lived in the U.S., and almost 1.5 million from the Philippines. The Dominican Republic, Cuba, South Korea, and India were also major sources of new Americans.
So during the 1960s, when all these other brown-skinned, woolly-haired immigrants start coming into the United States, we was in the middle of our Black Power movement.
Black is beautiful!
We was in the middle of our civil rights movement. You know, we kept this black identity and we even get deep with it. You know, we even brought it into metaphysics. We brought black into metaphysics. You know, we get real deep with black and we try to prove that black is the thing to be.
He had me feeling like black was the thing to be. He had me feeling like black was the thing to be.
In the darkest darkness, there is the essence of light, for God brought light out of darkness. So if God brought light out of darkness, then darkness is the mother of light.
So I'm thankful for all the teachers and messages that came through. Now I feel like I have a better understanding of the power of black, or the power within black.
And black is the mother of white.
The universal mother, the mother of everything you see in existence.
Black is the mother of white.
To my understanding, black is also somehow linked to the subconscious mind. Within black is all the information that ever was. It contains all. So from my understanding, all the colors came out of pure blackness. So some might say pure blackness is like the universal mother of all things. Some might say everything in existence came out of black, whether it was the blackness of space, the blackness inside the earth, the blackness of the mother's womb.
Each human being begins this life in total darkness. And in total darkness, the essence of light is present. In the darkest darkness, there is the essence of light.
With a basic sense of smell, the sperm, the smallest cell in the human body, sniff their way up the fallopian tube towards the egg, the largest cell in the body.
Woman is more than flesh. She is created by the Creator in such a magnificent way that she is a replication of the womb of creation.
You know, we got deep. We went through our black power movement where everything was black and black fists and, you know, the afros and, you know, we went through that whole thing. You know, there's a lot that can be said about pure black. Yes, black is great. However, the thing about blackness is pure blackness. Black is feminine energy. And that's the thing. Black is feminine energy. See, if you look through history, from my understanding, black was always equated with female energy.
The universal mother, the mother of everything you see in existence.
Black is the mother of white.
Black earth, black soil, Kemet, meaning the black land, is feminine, is Mother Earth.
Darkness is the mother of light.
They call it Mother Earth, like the earth is feminine, receiving the masculine light from the sun. Mother Earth, feminine, absorbs the rain, the water, the sunlight. It absorbs. Mother Earth is feminine energy.
The universal mother, the mother of everything you see in existence.
Black is the mother of white.
So blackness is known as feminine energy, is known to be a mother. Like in Egypt, they depicted the blackness of space as a female. Kemet, they depicted the blackness of space as a female, as a woman. Blackness is feminine, it absorbs light, like a woman's her sexuality, her vagina. She absorbs, she receives. It's feminine. Black is feminine, and it's the foundation of all things, but it's feminine. Feminine energy, it receives, takes in, absorbs. And the thing is, if we get so deep with black, we try to make black masculine. We'll say black power, and we'll try to make black masculine, but black throughout history, from my understanding, throughout history, black has never been a masculine energy. It's always been a feminine energy.
Black is the mother of white.
The universal mother, the mother of everything you see in existence.
Black is the mother of white.
So because Arabs and Caucasians called us black people, we accepted that name as black people, and we tried to have pride in being black. Most of us are browns, different shades of brown, and some of us are real dark brown. Some of us may be close to black in color, but again, that's just the outer shell of us. The inner being of us is masculine energy, but the outer shell of the human being belongs to the earth, and the earth is brown or black. I think one of the mistakes we've been making is trying to glorify black because they called us black, so we accepted their identity of us. And then I think the mistake we making is trying to glorify black and trying to make black a masculine energy. And black has never been known as a masculine energy.
Darkness is the mother of light.
In my opinion, one of the mistakes we've been making is trying to make black a masculine energy. From my understanding, black has never been known as a masculine energy or masculine force. Black is always a receiving energy. Like they say, black absorbs heat. Black has always been known to absorb, feminine, receive. So I feel like the mistake we've been trying to make black power. Black is not an aggressive, outgoing thrust of power. Black is not that. Black is a receiving energy. It's a receiving feminine energy. In my opinion, that's a mistake by us taking on this black identity that Europeans gave us. Europeans and Arabs are the ones that first called us black people.
Whoever shall harbor or conceal the said black will be prosecuted as the law directs.
Let the black go free.
You know what is so shocking? Like, you got a lot of blacks. A lot of Dominicans.
Hey, how you doing?
A lot of Puerto Ricans. A lot of West Indians.
Right.
A lot of Africans.
Right.
A lot of, and these dark-skinned people.
Right.
But they feel they're not black. I can't understand that.
But listen, but look, but you know,
but they speak a different language?
But look, Mike, you said not black, right?
Yeah.
Fat Mike just said it, what I think a major mistake our people are making. A mistake I think my brothers is making is now that we getting all the immigration, we getting the brown-skinned, woolly-haired people from different parts of the earth coming into our cities, coming into our neighborhoods. It seemed like we expect them to drop their nationality and just be black with us. And see, we kept the black Negro identity as our primary identity even after slavery ended. So now a lot of brown-skinned, woolly-haired immigrants are coming to America. It seemed like we expect them to drop their national flag, drop their national identity, and just be black with us. And most likely, that's not going to happen. The majority of them will probably never drop their national flag. They're going to always keep their national identity, keep their national flag. All over social media, you see little posts and things people put up like as if trying to make these other brown-skinned, woolly-haired people black, trying to make them drop their national identity and just become black with us. And most likely that's never going to happen. We're at a point in human history where people love their flags. They're not going to drop their flag. And what happens is people love their flags. They raise their flags and they unify around their flag. And their family and their children benefit from the unity. They benefit psychologically, they benefit financially, they benefit socially. They unify around their flag and their family and their children benefit from the unity. Look by comparison. How many of us African American men run around waving the red, white, and blue flag? If we see one of our brothers with a red, white, and blue flag, an American flag waving around, we would call them all kinds of names. We have not transitioned to love our nationality, whereas these other brown-skinned, woolly-haired people have. They love their flag and they love their nationality. And a mistake that some of us may be making, thinking that just because they're brown skin and woolly hair, they're supposed to come fight and help us in our issues. And most likely that's not going to happen. You may get one or two West Indians, one or two South Americans who will join us, but all in all, they're over here to get American money. They're not over here to join our issue, join our fight. To me, the way I see it, we're supposed to get on their level of forming a nationality that we could be proud of, that we can have dignity in.
And so now we have got to be about the formation of a nation in terms of our thought process.
If we got to the point where no matter what we felt towards each other, that we had unconditional love for a nation to be built, we would be free yesterday.
We should be forming a nationality that we can have dignity in. See, a lot of us, we don't respect America's history as far as our ancestors. We don't respect the history of America, so it's hard for a lot of us to say we're American. That's why I always speak on the importance of a sovereign nation. Reparation through sovereign nation. You know, us forming our own sovereign nation that we can name, give a name to it, and we can have dignity in our nation. A brand new nationality. It's up to us to form a brand new. It's up to us to form a nationality and have dignity in that nationality. So even the African Americans who decide to stay in America will still have a national name, whatever nationality we choose to form and name ourselves.
Every other race, why do they hate black people so much? Why are they afraid of us?